it is a good program. I think it is one that will help ensure a quality and safe environment, not only for today, but for the future, for our children and for future generations. And therefore, I support it, and I hope that it will be successful and pass on November 4th.
However, I don't see a necessity for giving a blank check to the Environmental Conservation Department or the other agencies involved to the tune of $1.45 billion.
What was meant to be a discussion, in fact, was a debate. Earlier this week, Democratic Assemblyman Maurice Hinchey and his Republican opponent for the 101st Assembly District spoke of the Environmental Quality Bond Act. The State Department of Environmental Conservation has been making a strong effort to push for passage of the Bond Act when voters go to the polls next Tuesday, Proposition 1. The provisions of the Act call for $1.45 billion with three major components. The first, $1.2 billion for the cleanup of hazardous waste sites throughout the state. That includes $100 million in no-interest loans for municipal non-hazardous waste landfill closures. Secondly, $250 million for land acquisition, including along the Hudson River, municipal and urban cultural parks, and historic preservation. And third, industry fees to equal 1/2 of the debt service to be incurred by the bonds issued to clean up the hazardous waste sites. The state says with the bond money, 500 sites can be cleaned up in a 13-year period instead of 40 years if only Superfund money is available. But as you'll find when we come back for this special edition of On the River, there is at least one person who finds the Bond Act debatable. The Environmental Quality Bond Act is a product, for the most part, of the efforts of Ulster County Assemblyman Maurice Hinchey, who chairs the Assembly Environmental Conservation Committee. Mr. Hinchey is running for re-election this year, and while there is almost no opposition to the Bond Act itself, there is some question over how some of the $1.45 billion should be divided. Opposing Mr. Hinchey for the Assembly seat from Ulster County is Ward Ingalsbe, a Kingston attorney who is among those who questions the Bond Act for the most part. Now, this broadcast was not intended to be a debate on the Bond Act, but an informational discussion of it. On the River each week discusses the river and its related subjects, especially environmental aspects. For this discussion, we have invited a panel of interested observers to question Assemblyman Hinchey and Mr. Ingalsbe. From Scenic Hudson is Cara Lee, that organization's environmental director. From the Poughkeepsie Journal, Dennis Kipp, who is that paper's environmental reporter. And Richard Halverson, the president of Hudson River Valley Association and president of Sleepy Hollow Restorations. We'll begin with Mr. Hinchey and his opening comments to last no more than 3 minutes, followed by Mr. Ingalsbe, also with 3 minutes. This format, by the way, is from one suggested by the Mid-Ulster League of Women Voters, and we thank them. Mr. Hinchey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Madden, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The proposition number 1 on the ballot this year asks all of us as voters the question, should we spend $1.45 billion to clean up New York State's toxic waste dump sites, at least the 500 worst of those toxic waste dump sites? The bond issue also provides a $100 million revolving fund, which would be used by localities as a no-interest loan to close out existing landfills. In addition to that, there is $250 million in the bond issue, which would be used for land acquisition, for urban cultural parks, for municipal parks, county and town parks, for historic preservation, and for access to waterways such as the Hudson River. The reason the bond issue is before us is that New York State has some 981 so far identified toxic waste dump sites. Those toxic waste dump sites are causing very serious health problems in many of the communities in which they are located. We know that these materials can cause cancer, they can cause birth defects, and they can also, and are in fact, causing contamination of our precious water supplies. With the bond issue, we will be able to clean up these toxic waste dump sites in approximately 13 years. Without the bond issue, at best, it will require some 40 years to clean up those 500 of the worst toxic dump sites. If the bond issue passes, it will generate a total of $4 billion for this cleanup program. $800 million will come from the federal Superfund to New York State as part of our allocation of the federal Superfund, and another $2.1 billion will be recovered from those companies who are responsible for the dumping of the toxic waste in the first instance. So a passage of the $1.45 billion bond issue will provide $1.2 billion from state treasury, and the remainder of that $4 billion will come from other sources. The cost of the bond issue is very modest, actually. It will be approximately $5 per person per year over the course of time that the bonds will be issued. And they will be issued over a period of time. All of the bonds will not be issued at once. They will be issued as it becomes necessary and as we are able to deal with each of the specific toxic dump sites. It is a good program. I think it is one that will help ensure a quality and safe environment, not only for today, but for the future, for our children and for future generations. And therefore, I support it, and I hope that it will be successful and pass on November 4th.
Okay, Mr. Ingalsbe.
Thank you, Brian, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I must take exception, Brian, to your opening statement that this bond issue is met with no opposition, and I will have to assert...
No, I said almost.
Almost, all right. Well, I'm going to count myself as one of those in opposition, not because I don't favor toxic cleanup. I'll preface my remarks by saying that I certainly am entirely in favor, and I understand the necessity for ridding ourselves of these toxic materials that will infect future generations. However, I don't see a necessity for giving a blank check to the Environmental Conservation Department or the other agencies involved to the tune of $1.45 billion. I can appreciate Mr. Hinchey's position since he's the architect of this plan, or one of the principal architects of it. But I don't think that he realizes that $1.45 billion is really $1,450 million. That's an awful lot of money to let out in a bond issue that will create exorbitant debt service. That same amount of money over the 13-year period that he discusses or mentions as the cleanup period would amount to about $145 million per year. On a $42+ billion budget, I feel that we can allocate these monies in other ways. New York State right now has the largest bonded indebtedness of any state in the United States. We've taken it too far already. I think we owe some other legacies to future generations in addition to the cleanup of the toxic waste. I think we can clean this mess up, if you will, without the imposition of this kind of a bond burden. I also note that there are various other riders attached to the bond issue, if you will, that total $250 million. And this in itself is a gigantic sum of money, and I don't think that it should be the $250 million item should be tacked onto the toxic cleanup aspect.
Okay, we have heard from the two gentlemen. We'll begin our questioning with Kara Lee from Scenic Hudson. Kara.
Thank you, Brian. The question has been raised in the last few weeks, and I think Mr. Ingalsbe has raised it again, as to whether bonding is an appropriate way to fund toxic cleanup in the state. And while no one is arguing that the program shouldn't be carried forth, some people are suggesting that it is a very expensive way to raise funds and that a yearly appropriation from the legislature would be a better way to go. And I'd like to ask Mr. Hinchey to respond to that and explain why the choice has been made to go with bonding as opposed to going to the legislature yearly.
Well, Kara, I was responsible for the passage of the original state Superfund back in 1980. Actually, it became law in 1981. We thought at that time that we were producing a state Superfund which would generate $10 million a year. It turned out that that particular bill produced only about $2.6 billion a year. We have been able to persuade, particularly the members of the state Senate, that we need to increase that Superfund, and we now have one that will produce about $30 million a year. However, in order to produce one that would generate $145 million a year, really would not be able to, I'm sure we wouldn't be able to do that. We wouldn't be able to get that amount of money passed through the legislature. Furthermore, if you do it that way, then you leave it up to the vagaries of the legislative process. You leave it up to a whole series of things, and you don't establish a program, which is what is needed in this particular case, a program which will be certain and one that which you can engage in at a certain point and see how it will progress over a period of time, and you can see an end to it, and you know that the resources that you will need to carry out that program will be available to you. So it's for those reasons. I mean, I have the experience of trying to work to get a Superfund. I've worked very hard, and with the greatest of efforts, we finally succeeded in getting one that would produce $30 million a year, as I mentioned. That $30 million, of course, will be used year after year to pay back, in part, the amount of money that will be required to pay back the bond issue. The important thing is, I think, how much is the bond issue going to cost us? And as I mentioned in my opening remarks, the cost of the bond issue to the people of New York State will be $5 per person per year over the lifetime of those bonds. So when you consider the task to be done and frankly, the urgency of it, I think that it's a responsible and reasonable and very practical way in which to proceed.
Okay, Mr. Ingalsbe.
May I ask, you've mentioned that $5 per person a couple of times. Does that, are you referring to the debt service?
No, that's the debt service and the principal.
The full, the gross amount?
Yes. That's been certified by the controller, by the way.
All right. If that's what it costs per year per person, I still don't see why we can't raise the money each year. We can commit ourselves to do this job and do it on an annual basis just as well as we can commit ourselves or pass a bond proposition to raise the money in one fell swoop. We're also overlooking the so-called windfall that everyone is expecting, and I've been looking for the governor or Mr. Hinchey or somebody in the legislature to tell us what we're going to do with the somewhere, I guess everybody's got this federal tax windfall, so-called, up to the $2 billion mark and more. What are we going to do with that money? We can earmark that or a part of it for these purposes.
Okay. Now we'll hear a question from our other panelist, Dennis Kipp of the Poughkeepsie-Journal. Dennis.
Thank you, Brian. Superfund programs on the federal and state level are generally meant to advance money for the cleanup of hazardous waste sites. Although I've heard you, Mr. Hinchey, say that $2.1 billion would be recovered from responsible parties. Are we giving up on the rest of the money, the $4 billion or whatever that we are spending on the cleanup? And what will the legal costs be paid out of to recover this money?
No, we're not giving up on the $4 billion. The $4 billion is the total estimated cost of cleaning up the 500 worst toxic waste dump sites over a 13-year period. It is estimated by the controller, by the legislature, by the governor, that 50% of that cost will be paid out of general revenues and 50% of that cost will be paid from responsible parties. The $2.1 billion is the 50% of the part that will be paid by the responsible parties. In other words, those people who were responsible for the dumping. That can be located. Now, in many cases, the people who were responsible for the dumping will not be located because many of these are municipal landfills that are now out of use and have been out of use for some length of time, years in many cases. And it is not known, nor does anyone have any idea how it can be known who dumped in those sites. In other cases, however, we do know who was responsible for the dumping there, and where we do know, where the state does know, where there is evidence for it, under the existing law, it is very possible and in some cases quite easy to go after those people who were responsible, documented responsibility, and to recover the costs associated with the cleanup.
Mr. Ingalsbe, would you like to comment?
Well, I think, number one, we don't know the full extent of the toxic situation. Sites have been identified, but the extent of materials in any particular dump, I think, is unknown, and we're not going to know, as I understand it, until we actually get into the cleanup itself. So we don't know what the ultimate bill is going to be. I don't think we can rely on collecting large sums of money, the bulk of the money, as anticipated, from, as we say, companies who did this in the past, because there are going to be so many defenses, legal fees or expenses are mentioned. There's so many variables here. Nobody has mentioned in the discussions I've seen the insurance cost that's going to be tacked on the end of this. So I don't think we know exactly where we're going with this thing. And again, I don't think that we have to saddle our state debt with a gigantic, and I mean gigantic, burden like this to get into the program that we need to clean up these toxic materials.
Now we'll hear from our third panelist, Mr. Richard Halverson, who is president of the Hudson River Valley Association and the president of Sleepy Hollow Restorations. Mr.
Thank you
Halverson.
very much. The word blank check, or the term blank check, was used earlier, and that's sometimes mentioned in connection with the bond issue. There is some concern in the Valley that people don't know precisely what the money is going to be spent on, either in terms of toxic waste cleanup or land acquisition. I was wondering, Assemblyman, are there going to be some procedures if this bond issue passes by which people in the Valley will be able to participate in that kind of decision-making?
Yes, absolutely. As a matter of fact, first of all, there is a scientific evaluation of the toxic waste dump sites to determine as best as is possible the amount of toxic materials that are in a particular site, and also, to the extent possible, what those materials are. In many cases, we have corporate records to use to go back on and to understand what is in a particular site. And a scientific process is used to establish a criteria. In other words, which are the most serious sites, which are the next most serious, and obviously the most serious ones, the ones that pose the greatest threat to communities that they're located in or are contaminating groundwater supplies, as many of them are right at this very moment. Those are the ones that will be addressed first. There will be, of course, a State Environmental Quality Review Act proceeding in every particular case, as is required by law, and there will be a hearing process on the bond issue generally and specifically with regard to each site, so that there will be ample opportunity for public participation by your group, for example, and by Scenic Hudson and by others, and all of us, the general public, to participate to whatever extent we see fit, so that we will know which sites are going to be addressed first, the most serious ones, and we will have an opportunity to comment and to work within that process, all of us as citizens.
Okay.
Well, this demonstrates one of the points that I make. Why are we going to find out what the problem is after we vote on the bond issue? Why are we going to have the public hearings? Why are we going to argue over this for who knows how long after we vote next week? I don't think we have to just vote this gigantic sum of money. It is a blank check. The statute is written in the most general language. Any layman can pick up a copy of it and he'll understand that it says they can do what they have to do to clean up toxic waste, period. And there are no particular restrictions on it, and that's a major concern to me.
Well, I must say, I must interject here to say that Mr. Ingalsbe misunderstands the whole situation. Although the question on the ballot is a simple question, and it's required to be in simple language so that it is easily and readily understood, the legislation behind it stipulates a program, a rationale, and a procedure, such as the one that I outlined just a few moments ago. In every particular case, there will have to be hearings, there will have to be public input, and there will have to be a scientific determination. That scientific determination is going on right now, as a matter of fact, because whether or not the bond issue passes, we're still going to have to clean up these toxic waste dump sites. The only question is, how long is it going to take us? With the bond issue, it'll take about 13 years. Without the bond issue, it will take about 40 years. In the process of that 40 years, it's pretty obvious that a lot of people are going to get sick, a lot of communities are going to be threatened, a lot of water supplies are going to be contaminated. That's the whole reason for putting the bond issue out in the first place.
I don't think there's any scientific proof of any of that, and I don't misunderstand. I've read Chapter 811 of the laws of 1986. I assume,
Well,
I think even you could understand it.
Then you
It's-
see the
it's writ-
procedure that's there.
No, it's written in very general terms, and it says that the agency will set up procedures and that the agency will undertake to clean up toxic waste, and that's just about what it says in about 3 pages.
Okay, we've had a little break in format here, but we'll allow it.
That's the way we like it.
Okay, Carol?
My question is, what can we as citizens do, and what can you do as an assemblyman to ensure that the Bond Act program is carried out as efficiently as possible so that that timetable that we're looking at can really be achieved?
Well, in each and every case, the legislature is going to have to exercise its oversight responsibility on the Department of Environmental Conservation, as it always must, with regard to every law, to make sure that it is carried out effectively and as was intended by the legislature and the governor. And in each particular case, there will have to be an appropriation of funds from the bond issue by the legislature year after year. All of this money is obviously not going to be appropriated in 1 year. It is going to be appropriated as the information becomes available, as the sites are designated for cleanup, and as we move from one to the other. And so the bonds will not be issued either. They will be held in abeyance until such time as the money is to be used. So it's not a question of putting it all out all at once. It's a matter of parceling it out objectively and carefully over a period of years to meet the needs as they are not only perceived, but as we develop the ability to deal with each and every site.
Mr. Ingalsbe.
We're dealing with some hypotheses here that I've heard no foundation for, namely that this 40-year figure, and I've heard other figures on it, 10 years versus 20 or 20 versus 30. I don't know who decided that it would take 13 years with the bond issue and 30 years without it. And I don't understand why that should be the case. So I think the whole question that we're going to get a speedier resolution here begins with an unproven hypothesis.
Okay, we have time for a quick question from either Dennis or Mr. Halverson. Would you?
Let me just ask about land acquisition and historic preservation. Mr. Ingalsbe, you kind of brushed them aside as riders a few minutes ago. I wondered how important you think that is to the Hudson River Valley and how important it is to the quality of life issues that are here in the valley, and if you support that portion of the Bond Act, either through the Bond Act or through some other means.
To the extent that the elimination of toxic materials will enhance the river, for example, which I think is the principal purpose of this meeting, certainly I'm for it, but again, we don't need the bond issue for that. Acquisition of land by the state, I have been railing against since the beginning of this campaign. The state already owns an awful lot of the property in this particular district and in the state of New York. And I don't think that we need a bond issue of $250 million to buy more state land. And I don't think we need it for access to the river, which is one of the arguments. There was a piece in the paper the other night where the DEC was preventing a private operator from making access to the river. And yet, on the other hand, they're trying to get $250 million to purchase access to the river. There's an awful lot of access to the river. I believe in private ownership of property. I don't believe in state acquisition of land excepting for necessary purposes, and I don't think we need to have $250 million in necessary purposes. I've heard Mr. Hinchey refer to this as only $250 million. Where I come from, $250 million is an awful, awful lot of money. And
we're running out of time. Mr. Hinchey, you have 1 minute.
Well, the fact of the matter is that there is a lot of access to the river in private hands, and that private property is being used to build condominiums and other things for very wealthy people. And if it continues that way, then only the very wealthy are going to have access to the Hudson River. That's one of the things that we were going to try to prevent, to make sure that people continue to have access to the river for recreational purposes. And I think that's very important. Furthermore, the Hudson River Valley is one of the most historic areas of not only New York State, but of the entire country. A major portion of that $250 million has to do with historic preservation, and it will be used to a large extent right here in the Hudson River Valley. Another part of that, part of the bond issue has to do with improvement of municipal parks for the city of Kingston and for the various towns up and down the river. Urban cultural parks. Kingston is the first urban cultural park in the state. Money is available for the enhancement of urban cultural parks. So there are a great many, I think, worthwhile purposes within the context of that section of the bond issue, and I think it's very important, as you suggest, to the quality of life in the Hudson River Valley, and I think that's another aspect of the bond issue that will cause people to look upon it favorably.
Okay, we have to wrap it up now, and as Mr. Assemblyman Hinchey started off. Mr. Ingalsbe, you have 1 minute to summate, and then Mr. Hinchey will have 1 minute.
I don't think we have to marry the two aspects of this bond issue and present them in one package. I think the addition of the $250 million to the $1.25 million toxic waste cleanup was designed to attract the votes of people interested in the other aspects that Mr. Hinchey just mentioned. I think that the two should be kept separate. I submit that the imposition of a $1.45 billion debt, additional debt on the state of New York is too much. It's not necessary. We can accomplish the toxic cleanup in other ways that will not put this legacy of horrendous debt on our children, and it will do the same job in the same amount of time.
Assemblyman Hinchey.
Well, this is not a legacy of horrendous debt. If it were, it would not be supported by the state comptroller. The state comptroller, Ned Reagan, is a very conservative gentleman, and he manages the state's affairs and its finances very well. He endorses the State Environmental Quality Bond Act wholeheartedly. It's also endorsed, obviously, by Governor Cuomo and candidate for Governor Andrew O'Rourke. It's endorsed by almost everyone who is running for public office, and by a great many other people around the state, the League of Women Voters, virtually every environmental group, and a great many obviously private citizens. It is an opportunity for us to remedy the mistakes of the past, some very, very serious mistakes of the past, to clean those mistakes up and to get on with the business of the future, and to ensure that we have a quality environment for ourselves presently, for our children, and for future generations. That's what the Environmental Quality Bond Act is all about. It's a very small price to pay, $5 per person per year, to accomplish all of that in a relatively short period of time.
Okay, thank you. And we thank you for joining us on this special edition of On the River. Our panelists tonight have been Cara Lee of Scenic Hudson, Dennis Kipp of the Poughkeepsie Journal, and Richard Halverson of the Hudson River Valley Association and Sleepy Hollow Restorations. And of course, Assemblyman Maurice Hinchey and his Assembly opponent this year, Mr. Ward Ingalsbe. Again, thank you and good night.